Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Steve Barrows, chief operating officer at the Acton Institute. Today we'll be talking about the entrepreneur and pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai, who was sentenced by a Hong Kong court to 20 years in prison on Monday, February 9th, in his sort of landmark national security trial. Last time I was together with Steve, we were talking about the conviction. Now sentencing has occurred. This is from the report of the New York Times on Monday, February 9th. For decades, Jimmy Lai, the media mogul, used his wealth and his newsroom in Hong Kong to criticize Beijing's authoritarian excesses and give a voice to those who hoped for democracy in China. On Monday, as a court in Hong Kong sentenced him to 20 years in prison, the city made clear that defiance now carries the same price as it does across the border. The landmark ruling completes a years-long effort by Beijing to dismantle the influence of the self-proclaimed troublemaker, who it blamed for masterminding Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests nearly 7 years ago. Critics say that Beijing declared Mr. Lai guilty before he could ever receive a fair trial. The decision reached far beyond one man's fate. Along with Mr. Lai, 6 of his former employees at the shuttered Apple Daily newspaper were sentenced to terms of up to 10 years, establishing a grim new benchmark for the city's once freewheeling media. While the government maintains that these cases are about national security, the scale of the penalties underscores the narrowing window for independent journalism in what was once Asia's media hub. Those other Apple Daily folks, it's important to recognize. They're often overlooked. Where Jimmy has a long time association with the Acton Institute, but these folks are also facing very dire circumstances in prison. From another story reporting on those journalists, on Monday, the court handed down a 10-year prison term to the paper's leading editorial voices, editor-in-chief Law Wai Kwan, executive editor Lam Man Chung, and editorial writer Feng Wai Kong. Others received significant terms as well. Young Ching Ki, another editorial writer, was sentenced to 7 years and 3 months. An associate publisher, Chan Puman, 7 years, and Cheng Kim Hung, a publisher, 6 years and 9 months. Steve, welcome to Acton Line. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Dan.
We have a lot of very sad news to catch up on.
Right.
We've all been following this very eagerly at Acton. The week of the sentencing, we're now a week out from the sentencing. We shared a message from Father Robert on the podcast, a very short message, just sort of expressing, I think, what all of us feel right here at Acton right now, but without getting into sort of the nitty-gritty of things like we're going to get into today.
Right.
What do you make of these latest developments?
Yeah, it's obviously a tragic miscarriage of justice. And it's clear to me that Beijing is not interested in so-called national security. They're really about suppressing free speech. And I think this is illustrated by the list of the individuals from Apple Daily who also received very severe prison sentences. And if you recall in the news, one of the things that they've said that this case hinges on is that Jimmy met with, at the time, Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo. And I suppose you could assert that meeting he was conspiring to do something that was a threat to Hong Kong and China's national security. Of course, he denied that, and there's no evidence that nobody has recordings of those meetings. But the fact that they went ahead and gave these very severe punishments also to people who were simply on the editorial staff of a major newspaper that had a contrarian view of things that wasn't pleasing to Beijing just goes to show you that it really was all about free speech from the beginning. It wasn't anything about conspiring to do something damaging to China or Hong Kong in Jimmy's interactions with leaders in the United States.
This is This is a very severe sentence.
Yes.
It's a severe sentence for all those sentences, but for Jimmy in particular, he's in his late 70s, has diabetes, has other severe health problems. This is essentially a life sentence. That is a lot to bear. Jimmy has been in solitary confinement over 1,800 days now. And that doesn't look to be changing. Folks don't understand, I think a lot of times, these are sort of very abstract numbers. These are years, but this is most of this will be served in solitary confinement.
Right.
I interviewed Claire Lai, his daughter, which will be the episode after this, in which we'll talk a little bit about how Jimmy's doing in prison, and where he finds strength to get through. But, he doesn't even have light to read by oftentimes. This is, his mail is restricted, his communications is restricted. His pastoral visits are restricted. It's not just the years, but it is the way that prisoners are treated.
Sure.
Is also horrific, and that's something that these other folks at Apple Daily are going to struggle with as well, and something that I think is important to draw attention to.
Yes, very much so. And Claire also wrote a very moving article that was published in Unheard. That is out now. And in that, she describes some of the physical struggles that her father has gone through. And you can just see it when you see him in person. And she articulates very well the suffering that he's undergoing. I think that it's clear he's just a political prisoner. A number of both the Secretary of State of the United States has spoken out against this, as well as the governments of other countries across the globe, human rights organizations, and people are recognizing exactly for what this is. He's a political prisoner and is suppressing of free speech. And Hong Kong was always supposed to maintain the essence of the basic law when 1997 handover was made. And then they've implemented since 2020 this national security law, which is being used as a pretext for Beijing to get their way with Hong Kong.
And it's been a tragedy for the entire city. Months back, I interviewed Mark Clifford, who wrote the biography Troublemaker of Jimmy Lai. And I asked him about Hong Kong in that interview. And he's like, the city is not the vibrant, when Jimmy Lai was an entrepreneur, when Hong Kong was the envy of the world in many respects. And the political freedoms have been suppressed, but also it's economically less vibrant, because we know at Acton that those two things go together.
That's right.
And this is a tragedy for Jimmy, for his family, for the other reporters and journalists at Apple Daily, but also for the citizens of Hong Kong at large.
Yes, absolutely. If you watch The Hong Konger, which is the documentary we produced and released several years ago, we talk about, and people in that movie are interviewed about how anxieties were elevated back in 1997 when the handover was made. But then I think it was actually Claire in her article that mentioned after the national security law was passed in July of 2020, you could actually detect subtle changes in people's facial expressions in the city. That there was this sort of ominous, overarching cloud that they knew that Beijing had a completely different worldview, and that the vibrancy that had made Hong Kong what it was and always has been was suddenly going to be eventually dissolved. And so it's once again a tragic thing, not only for the people of Hong Kong, but especially for Jimmy Lai and his compatriots who are now and had these severe sentences.
Yeah. Jimmy's family has been a very large part of this story. His wife, Teresa, was at the sentencing.
Yes.
Cardinal Zen, who has supported the family throughout this, was there. His children have become his advocates internationally. That's a very moving dimension of this story, and they are being heard.
That's right.
In Washington, D.C., in the United Kingdom. And they are sort of engaged right now in a lot of advocacy for their father.
Yes.
Because this is one of those things, and this is why we're doing this podcast, is we're not doing this to dwell on the negative, but because the sentencing is another one of these events where Jimmy's story can be told.
That's right.
And he can be advocated for. And this is an opportune moment when the world is paying attention again. And you have to take these. And his children have done such a heroic job in trying to bring attention to their father's plight, trying to bring attention to the plight of everyone in Hong Kong. What have your impressions of the family been?
Well, certainly you're right. I think the family, and this is one thing that was very moving in Claire's writing the piece that she wrote for Unheard, is that initially, she's, as any child would, you struggle when you see relative suffering, and a suffering that could effectively have been avoided had Jimmy not been the man of conviction that he was and was able to just, with the wealth that he had, he could have easily left the city before things started to take a turn for the worse. And so there was some hesitancy at times emotionally, but she at the same time recognizes the spiritual implications of what's happening. And as does, I'm sure, Sebastian and Teresa, they all recognize that Jimmy is a man of deep faith. And this is something that a communist regime would not be able to grasp, that in the mystery of Christianity, suffering is essential to our redemption. We see it, of course, in the crucifixion of Christ, and Jimmy knows he's participating in that in some way, and as a result, is giving meaning to his suffering, and so seeing that his own children, his own family recognize this, it gives them both the desire to continue to fight for their father's liberation, but also a way to endure their own suffering in seeing their father suffer, because they, of course, adhere to those same kinds of ideas.
There's been a lot of outstanding reporting by media around the world on this case. But one of the great things that the family's advocacy does is it gives you a window into that spiritual dimension of Jimmy's life in prison, which is underreported, and which is something that I was very excited to sit down with Claire and talk about. And it's something that whenever you talk to the family, they talk about.
Yes.
And it's an amazing. In this way, Jimmy Lai becomes not just a political prisoner who is unjustly in prison, but offers a powerful sort of spiritual witness.
That's right.
And it's incredible.
That's right. And it is, that Christianity has always been a faith where people recognize that suffering brings about redemption. And in this case, we see that Jimmy has been given great faith to endure the sufferings that he has. His family recognizes that. I understand and have seen images of opportunities where he's focused on sketches, either the crucifixion or of the Virgin Mary, are two areas or two images he likes to reproduce in his own artistry. And so there we see, once again, the faith of the family coming to the forefront. And this is the puzzle that causes people who aren't believers to say, I don't understand this. It's paradoxical. Why would these people be thinking this is actually a victory in some deeper sense for them? But it is. And at the same time, we have to continue to bring his plight to the forefront and say, he's been the victim of an unjust sentence. We need to do what we can to get him liberated from that, from prison.
Mm-hmm. The church has had a complicated relationship with China over the last couple of years. There's an agreement in place with China, not all of which is public, into how the church is allowed to operate in China. Cardinal Zen has been very outspoken, been very supportive, has been very visible in his support. What do you hear, or what would you like to hear from the church beyond, Cardinal Zen, who has been, an amazing advocate for the family throughout all of this, but he is a prince of the church, but he is merely one.
Yes.
And it would be wonderful if others could be more visible, but that's challenging in an environment where churchmen are responsible. They have a pastoral duty, of course, to Jimmy. Mm-hmm. But they have a pastoral duty also to Christians in China who all face challenges in living out their faith in a communist nation.
Yes. It's difficult to really say what I would like to see, other than I am bothered by the secret nature of the agreement and what is, by all evidence, a continued persecution of Christians within China in spite of an alleged agreement which was, I think, designed to give them more space to worship freely and live out their faith. Obviously, mainland China is severely restrictive of what Christians can do and persecutes the church both above ground and underground. Hong Kong, a little bit better, certainly, but not what we would like to see there either. Frankly, my sense of these things is that Cardinal Zen knows what he's talking about, at least in terms of the Chinese Communist Party cannot be trusted to maintain their end of the bargain. We just don't know from behind the curtain what all things were going on in the Vatican's mind when they negotiated this agreement under Pope Francis, and perhaps Pope Leo will have a different take on how things are going. And of course, it's under review every couple of years, I think. And so a wait to be seen. Certainly, I hope that whatever is done in the future with that agreement, it can also be connected to some of the things that we're actually seeing happen to Jimmy in Hong Kong.
There has also been a response from the American government. There's been occasional voices of support. The family very much has been in contact with government officials, has felt that there's a good, positive relationship there. But again, it hasn't been as forthright as maybe I might like. But again, these things are complicated, and there are different things that have to be weighed. And the most effective way to apply pressure often isn't the most visible way to apply pressure. What have you made of the American government's?
Well, certainly there's been regular responses. Like I said, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio had released a statement, of course, condemning the decision. And President Trump has indicated that he really wants to have Jimmy released. And so we hope that at some diplomatic level, there are negotiations and conversations continuing. As you mentioned, there are many, many factors, and sometimes the pressures that's most effective are the ones that aren't as public. Who knows? Maybe there's an opportunity to allow so-called saving face coupled with the release of Jimmy so that China sort of gets their symbolic victory while at the same time we get what we really want, which is an unjustly persecuted man released from prison and freed, especially here at the end of his life. And so that's what I'm hoping is going on.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm going to be watching in the coming months is President Trump and
Xi
are going to be meeting in April.
Yes.
Early April. The summit, they've done an official date, but it sounds like first week of April is what's been negotiated. President Trump will be going to Beijing for that meeting. My hope is that oftentimes when you have these sort of high-profile meetings, gestures are made.
Yes.
To signal an openness to sort of restarting a relationship, deepening a relationship. A very powerful gesture would be the release of Jimmy Lai. And that's something that we're all hoping for, we're all praying for. But that's another time that I think we will be back on this podcast with that visit, trying to make that more visible. We ask folks at home to pray for Jimmy, of course, to pray for Jimmy's family, but to pray for that summit as well.
Yes.
Because this might be an opportunity where there's a potential off-ramp here. And Jimmy could enjoy his freedom once more, his physical freedom. He's spiritually very free.
That's right.
Which is very
encouraging,
encouraging to hear.
Yes.
What are your hopes for that?
Well,
summit?
I certainly hope for the same thing. And as you point out, one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast is to maintain the attention on Jimmy's plight, because it's easy to allow it to just sort of fade into the background as if it's a done deal and nothing more is to be done for him. It's not. It's pretty obvious to me that the timing of some of these major events from Hong Kong have occurred during times when there are predictable other things that people are focused on. So, for example, a lot of the initial trials, between 2020 and the present, have occurred right around Christmas time, when the media is focused on a lot of and people in the West are focused on Christmas activities and the New Year and so forth. And of course, this one dropped, at least from an American perspective. The sentencing happened the day after the Super Bowl, which has other people distracted on other things. And so we want to make sure that people don't just say, well, it's now over. No, as long as Jimmy is alive, we still need to plead for his case. And so we want to draw attention to that. And I do hope that President Trump and diplomats behind the scene are preparing to say we need a symbolic moment here of cooperation and collaboration, which includes the release of Jimmy Lai.
We'll be praying for that. Write your representatives, your government officials for this. They know about this, and the more support that we can make visible, the more in the front of their minds it will be. So we are all just, it's been a sad week in the office, but it's been also a very motivating week.
That's right.
Because this is a very concrete way in which we hope to make a difference and hope to rally other people in taking up that charge to make a difference for Jimmy, for his family, for Hong Kong, and hopefully for the good of all of China.
Absolutely. And if anybody listening to this podcast is not familiar with the full story of Jimmy Lai, I encourage you to go to thehongkongermovie.com and view the documentary that we created and had a number of very, very important interviews which tells his story, and then share that with others.
Steve, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Dan. Appreciate being here.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.